ecclesia, the called out ones, children of God, saints, holy and blameless in His sight. All that's true because of this book, and specifically because of the book of Hebrews. I've titled today's message, From Refugee to Royalty. And hopefully that comes through in today's text. So today's text is an interesting text. Hebrews chapter 2, if you'll turn there, Hebrews chapter 2, we're going to begin at verse 10. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. Hebrews is near the end of the second half of the Bible, the New Testament. Brittany Warner and Braxton Warner enjoy a unique relationship with my wife and I. There are children. There are family. Because of that, they enjoy unique access and privilege to us and with us. For example, I still enjoy hanging out with my daughter regularly. We call them daddy-daughter dates. We still regularly go on daddy-daughter dates. Typically it revolves around a book and coffee. My wife just yesterday morning went out. It was an overdue Mother's Day present, but went out to Lake Chevenon and fished for about 4 hours with my son. What's that? With our son, yes. With our son, yes. And notice I was not invited to go fishing. There's a reason for that. But right now, neither one, in the interest of complete transparency, neither one of our children are walking closely with the Lord, or at least as closely as my wife and I would like to see them walk. You see, for a season, they have found something better than Jesus. Let me say that again. For a season, they have found something better than Jesus. And that's the situation, or close to it, that the Hebrews, or the audience of the book of Hebrews, finds themselves in. They're wondering, is Jesus really better than? And although my wife and I, our hearts hurt for our children, although we suffer for them, my wife and I continue to pursue relationship with Brittany and Braxton, striving to love them as well as we can and help them understand that there is, in fact, nothing better than Jesus. So, in our text today, in our passage today, it's an interesting text, a lot going on in it. The writer of Hebrews is putting the finishing touches on his contrast between Jesus and the angels. So this is about the last we're going to hear of Jesus is better than the angels, because he's going to segue into another element, contrasting Jesus. The next segment is Jesus better than Moses. So he's segueing out of Jesus is better than the angels, and this passage today is going to serve as a segue into next week's message, which is Jesus is better than Moses. But although this passage is a segue, it's also rich in information regarding two things that I think are especially meaningful or especially important for Christians: the theme of suffering and the theme of family. The theme of suffering and the theme of family. So, with your indulgence, allow me to do something a little bit different today. Rather than walk through Hebrews 2, 10 through 18 sequentially, verse 10, and 11, and 12, and 13, all the way through verse 18, I think it might be easier if we see, first of all, what the writer is doing in verse 16, which I think is the glue that holds his passage together. We'll go to verse 16 first, and then we're going to look at the two themes. First, suffering, and then the theme of family. So if you'll turn to verse 16, and we'll begin there. Verse 16, Hebrews 2. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. I think that sentence ties this whole passage together. Here we have the angels, here we have this idea of helping, and we'll see what that actually looks like, the suffering of Christ on our behalf. And here we have family, or the offspring of Abraham. So this is the last mention of angels in the book of Hebrews until all the way into chapter 12. They're mentioned once in chapter 12, they're mentioned once in chapter 13, but in totally different contexts. Jesus is not being compared or better than the angels, different context. So the writer of Hebrews, again, is wrapping up his comparison, his contrast between Jesus and the angels. This interesting phrase, offspring of Abraham. So this family phrase refers much more than the kind of genetic Jewishness of the audience of the writer of Hebrews. It refers also, and maybe more to, the promises that God made to Abraham. But he helps the offspring of Abraham. This is all about God's promises all the way back in the book of Genesis that have carried through to the writer's day and, in fact, to our day. The point is this: God is faithful. So our gaze turns from angels to the promises to the promiser. And that's what's happening in verse 16. Our gaze is being turned. I'm gonna cheat a little bit, and I'm going to have you fast forward a little bit in the book of Hebrews to Hebrews chapter 6. I think Hebrews chapter 6, beginning at verse 13, really helps us understand verse 16 here. So Hebrews 6, verse 13, really helps us understand this whole idea of the promise and the promiser. I'm going to start verse 13, Hebrews 6. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself. How cool is that? Saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So, when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. By the way, last I checked, God doesn't lie. And last I checked, God is a man of his word. So that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to do what? Stay at it. Hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this. This what? This hope based on what? God's character and his promises. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. Jesus is better than anything. He can be trusted. Guys, life is hard, yes? Yeah, we're all going through something. Maybe more accurately, we're all going through some things, plural. In this fallen world, that is our reality. But does that mean we are without hope? I kind of think not. If the book of Hebrews is about anything, if there's any word that captures the book of Hebrews, it's the word hope. Almost done with verse 16. There's this word in there twice, helps. He helps, he helps. And this word is interesting, has an interesting nuance. It means to lay hold of something, to seize it in order to rescue it, or in order to save it. Years ago, when Brittany was about 11 years old, I used to be in landscaping in a former life, and I brought my landscape trailer home, backed it up in the backyard, and the kids were, I was inside, and the kids were outside playing with it. It had a heavy gate with a latch on either side. Well, the kids were playing with it, and they didn't realize how heavy the gate was, and it came down and gashed my daughter's wrist. So I heard the crying and went out and saw this gash, and what would any loving father do in a situation like that? I seized my daughter. I grabbed her. I picked her up in order to rescue her, in order to care for her. That's what your Heavenly Father has done for you. He has seized us, grabbed us, taken hold of us in order to rescue us. Jesus didn't do that for angels. God didn't do that for angels. He does that for human beings. Another story, not as serious, although it could have been. My son and I were floating down in Missouri on a river, a wonderful river called Current River. And he was actually tied, he was about 7 years old, and he was tied to my tire, my inner tube. So tied by a rope. And I wasn't really paying that close of attention. But we were starting to drift towards the shore, and there's branches hanging out into the water from the shore. And he kind of got like grabbed by a branch, and his tire flipped over, and for a few seconds, what I'm sure felt like an eternity to him, he was underwater. So I had to quickly seize the tube, turn it over, seize him, grab him, and rescue him. He may remember it differently, but I'm telling you, that's how it happened. It wasn't on purpose. It was an accident. The audience, so I can kind of understand. I can kind of understand where the audience, where these Hebrews are coming from. They are refugees twice over. They are refugees among their own people. One of the penalties, one of the social penalties, if you will, for following Christ, or leaving Judaism and following Christ, is you were ostracized from the synagogue. You were kicked out of the synagogue, which meant you were basically kicked out of the social life of Israel. Think about it. The only social order, the only family you ever knew. Refugees among their own people. I said they were refugees twice over. They were also refugees among the Romans. So Nero's persecution is beginning to heat up. At this time, Judaism still enjoyed favored status. They didn't have to pay tribute to Nero, did not have to pay tribute to the emperor. So they're still good to go. Christianity, different story. As Christianity emerges from Judaism, it is seen as not as a sect anymore of Judaism, but its own faith, its own religion. So Christianity did not enjoy the perks that Judaism did. So not only were these Hebrews refugees among their own people, they were refugees in the world. They were refugees among the Romans. I get it. I mean, to a point, it's understandable. What it must have been like for the writer's audience to seek to return to safety, to seek to return to comfort, to seek to return to Judaism, to favored status. But the author of Hebrews says emphatically, no, 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 no. Because they would simply have been returning one refugee status for another refugee status. So instead of being refugees among their own people as well as the Romans, they would have become refugees among God's family and from God's family. God had already helped them by laying hold of them, by seizing them, by rescuing them through the suffering of his Son, through his blood, by which they enjoyed infinitely greater favored status, that of royalty. Last I checked, when your father is a king, that makes you royalty. They were in danger of exchanging all of that for another refugee stepped in. And that's why our first thing, the example of Jesus' suffering, is so important. So theme number 1, suffering. We're going to look at verses 10, 14, and 15, and 18. So verse 10. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. The founder of their salvation. First I want to go to, it was fitting. That's a reference to verse 9 just above. But we see him, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting. Why was it fitting? Because that was the plan all along. Jesus was a willing participant in this sacrificial death, in this redemption of humanity. He did not go to the cross kicking and screaming. It was the plan from somewhere in eternity past. It was the plan all along. Founder. That word founder can be a little bit misleading. It literally means pioneer. Jesus is our pioneer. The tip of the spear, so to speak. The one who has gone before. Hear this. Jesus is the trailblazer of our salvation. He has been there first. He has done it first. He has suffered first. He gets it. We are not walking into uncharted territory. Jesus has already been there. And then the word perfect, making the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. Interesting. Through suffering. Jesus was consecrated or perfected for his high priestly role that is touched on in this passage through suffering. There's a picture that the writer of Hebrews is trying to paint for his audience. And there's a picture that the writer of Hebrews is trying to paint for us. There is value in suffering. Now, I don't wake up every morning thinking, how can I suffer for Jesus today? If that's you, I think you might have an issue. But suffering finds us, doesn't it? You don't have to go looking for it. It tends to find you. The Hebrews were wanting to run, man. To run from suffering. What's the model of Jesus? What's the example of Jesus? He ran to suffering. They're running away from it. He ran to it. As a result, he understands, he gets it as our high priest. He understands temptation. We're going to get to that a little bit. Verses 14 and 15. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death, here it is, this suffering theme again, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. I just want to throw something your way. And don't hear what I'm not saying. Allow me to finish the thought. The ancients, basically because they had to, but the ancients pondered death much more than we do. They pondered death at least for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was all around them. And number two, they tended not to live as long as we live. Their lives tended to be shorter. So they pondered death, at times to the point of being consumed with death, unhealthy. I don't think that we ponder death enough. I don't think that we ponder our mortality enough. And I'm not talking about in a morbid way, but last I checked, sooner or later, right? 2 or 3 times a year, no joke, 2 or 3 times a year, I intentionally spend about an hour, hour and a half walking through a cemetery, just by myself. Why? Perspective. I look at the names. And I think, and I look at how long did they live? I look at the date of birth. I look at the date. How long did they live? Some longer than others. And the thought hits me. Just like me, at one time, they walked this earth. But they're not walking this earth anymore. And one day, that will be true of me. Bill, what are you doing with the gift of the one life that you've been given? I don't think we ponder death enough. Again, not in a morbid way, but in a way that brings perspective. Now, I'm gonna throw a phrase at you, and I want you to hear it carefully, because this is so like God. Here's what, verse 14, here's what happened. Because of what Jesus did, he brought death to death through death. Let me say it again. Because of what he accomplished on the cross and his resurrection, he brought death to death through death. Jesus killed death by his death. Let that sink in. I don't know where else you get that outside of Christianity. I don't know what other faith system. I don't know what other worldview gives you that kind of a Savior. Jesus is better than anything. Still holds true today. Death to death by his death. So much for the introduction. Kidding. Paul gets it. He picks up on this in Colossians chapter 1. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that is in Christ, and through Christ to reconcile everything to himself by making, and there it is, by making what? Peace through the blood. Who does that? Where else do you get that? Where else do you get that kind of laying hold of? Where else do you get that kind of seizing from a God to his people outside of Jesus Christ? I pondered, so what's the opposite of fearing death? In verse 15, who those all their lives he's freed them. They feared death. They were in slavery to death. Now they know. What's the opposite of fearing death? And my mind turned towards this book and a certain lady who has become a sort of inspiration and a distance for me. Many of you know her name. Her name is Johnny Erickson Tada, when Johnny was 17. She suffered a diving accident. She dove headfirst into a shallow body of water, hit a rock. As a result, she was paralyzed from the neck down, quadriplegic. She is still in a wheelchair today, over 50 years later. Still in a wheelchair today. She said, by the way, as an aside, she said in an interview with Lee Strobel, I have this injury, talking about suffering, this injury, this wheelchair, has pushed me up against God. I now know things about God to a depth of intimacy that I never could have without this wheelchair. And she said this, I wouldn't trade this wheelchair for anything. How's that for a perspective on suffering? In the foreword to a book about lament, she writes, "When a broken neck ambushed my life and left me a quadriplegic, I felt as though," hear these words, feel these words, "I felt as though God had smashed me underfoot like a cigarette. At night, I would thrash my head on my pillow, hoping to break my neck at a higher level and thereby end my misery." After I left the hospital, I refused to get out of bed. I told my sister, "Just close the drapes, turn out the light, shut the door." My paralysis was permanent, and inside, I died. That's how I felt. But after weeks in bed, I got tired of... Here's what I think is the answer to the question, what's the opposite of fearing death? After weeks in bed, I got tired of being depressed, and I finally cried out, "God, if I can't die, please show me how to live." And she concludes, it was just the prayer that God was waiting for. I think that is the opposite of fearing death. God, show me how to live. Verse 18. "For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." One of my favoriteest, if that's a word, passages in the whole book of Hebrews. Right here. "For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." Suffered when tempted. Church, children of God, saints, Jesus gets it. In fact, I'm going to suggest to you, he gets it better than we do when we're talking about temptation. I think C.S. Lewis nailed it when he talked about us in temptation and God in temptation. He says, "No man knows how bad he is till he has tried very hard to be good. A silly idea is current that good people do not know what temptation means. This is an obvious lie. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. You find out the strength of a wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. A man who gives in," and here's the thrust of what he's saying, "a man who gives in to temptation after 5 minutes simply does not know what it would have been like 1 hour later." That is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They have lived a sheltered life by always giving in. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside of us until what? Until we try to fight it, until we try to resist it. And Christ, because he was the only man who never yielded to temptation, is the only man who knows to the full what temptation means. The only complete realist. When it comes to temptation, what's the truth? We have all given in at points in temptation, right? Whenever we give in to a temptation, we are never fully exercised by that temptation. Jesus was always fully exercised by every temptation. So there's a sense that he understands badness better than we could ever understand badness. He gets it, child of God. He understands your temptation better than you understand your temptation. So if I could offer a summary of this first theme, if I could offer a summary of the suffering theme in this passage in Hebrews, it might sound something like this. Jesus' suffering entitled him, empowered him, and enabled him. His suffering entitled him to serve as our high priest, empowered him to destroy Satan and death, and enabled him to help us in our temptation. Theologians D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo, in their book, in their text, write this, and let this sink in. It is infinitely better to share his disgrace than to defect from his grace. It is infinitely better to share his disgrace. Isn't that what Paul said? It's a joy to join Jesus in the fellowship of his suffering. It is a joy for us to join Jesus in the fellowship of his suffering. Infinitely better to share his disgrace than to defect from his grace. Dear saints, suffering is not unique to us. It's not unique to you. It's not unique to me. As our pioneer, Jesus has traveled the road first. He gets it, so don't give up. Don't give up your status of royalty and return to that for refugee. Second, the second theme is family. Verses 11, 12, and 13, and 17. So verse 11, at least the first part. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. The word sanctify, sanctification, root word holy. We might reword it like this. For he who makes holy and those who are holy all have one source. And that phrase, one source, is interesting. It has a couple of possible potential meanings. Maybe both are at play here. One source. It could mean Jesus and our common ancestry with Adam, or it could mean Jesus and our common ancestry with God the Father. Either way, the point is this: solidarity. Jesus has solidarity with us. Familial, family solidarity with us. Verse 11b just blows me out of the water. That is why he, Jesus, is not ashamed to call them brothers. Do we get that? Do we understand that? Jesus is not, let me put it in plain language. Jesus is not ashamed to call you family. That's soul nourishment right there. Not ashamed to call you brother. Not ashamed to call you sister. Not ashamed to call you family. Then the writer continues, quoting from Psalm 22 and Psalm 8, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. I'm not ashamed. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me. The word brothers there is a plural in the Greek. Could mean, given the context, just brothers, or could mean brothers and sisters. I want to go back to that not ashamed piece. I can't let that go. Dane Ortland, in his wonderful devotional book, Gently and Lowly, puts it this way. Here is the promise of the gospel, the message of the whole Bible. In Jesus Christ, we are given a friend who will always enjoy rather than refuse our presence. Hopefully it will come up there. In Jesus Christ, we are given a friend who will always enjoy rather than refuse our presence. This is a a companion whose embrace of us does not strengthen or weaken, depending on how clean or unclean, how attractive or revolting, how faithful or fickle we presently are. He is not ashamed to call you family. You can feast on that the rest of the week, and you'd be good to go. Because if we're being honest, we don't always feel that way, do we? I know I don't. Way too often, I'm on the other end of, how could you put up with me, Lord? Really? How can you stand me sometimes? That's a wrong picture of who he is. Verse 17, therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. Why? So that he might become, and here's the first mention of it, a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people. High priest, I'm not going to spend time here because later on in the book, the writer extensively unpacks this term high priest as it relates to Jesus. I will say this. You have someone who has the Father's ear on your behalf. You have someone who has the Father's ear on your behalf. Your intercessor and your advocate, Jesus Christ. Propitiation. This is a term, it's just so many nuances of this term. It is pregnant with meaning. It means to satisfy, to show mercy, to display favor towards. In this case, it means that Jesus has satisfied God's divine wrath concerning our sin, which then frees God to extend favor and mercy toward us. Jesus has satisfied God's divine wrath toward our sin, which then frees God to favor us, to extend mercy to us. If I could summarize the family theme, it might sound something like this. As our elder brother, Jesus protects and provides for us while enjoying our presence. His name was Ben Hooper. Ben Hooper, many years ago, grew up in the foothills of East Tennessee. But in the foothills of East Tennessee, when Ben Hooper grew up in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, little boys and little girls like Ben, who were born to unwed mothers, were treated terribly, treated as outcasts. By the time little Ben Hooper was 3 years old, the other children would scarcely play with him. Parents were saying insensitive things like, "What's a boy like that doing playing with our children?" As if Ben had anything to do with his birth. Saturday was the toughest day of all. That's when Ben and his mother would go into town, buy supplies, and of course the chatter happened among the people, the gossip, the backbiting. Invariably, the other parents in the store would make rude comments, just loudly enough. You know how this works. You get the game. Just loudly enough for mother and son to hear comments like, "Has anybody ever figured out who his daddy is?" In those days, there was no kindergarten. So at 6 years old, Ben entered the first grade, and it was very common to see him staying at his desk for recess, staying at his desk for lunch, eating it alone. It was a tough childhood for little Ben Hooper. Well, it was a big big deal, a big event, when anything of substance or change happened in that little town in the foothills of East Tennessee. But when Ben was 12 years old, love this, new preacher came to pastor Ben's church, or the church in Ben's town. And almost immediately, this young preacher made such an impact in this small community that almost immediately, little Ben Hooper began hearing things about this preacher. Things like how friendly he was, how accepting he was, how non-judgmental he was, and how when you were in his presence, he made you feel like you were the most important person in the whole world. One Sunday, though he had never been to church a day in his life, you can understand, little Ben Hooper decided he would attend. So he arrived late and left early. Sat in the back. No one would notice. No one would ask. No one would talk. And he left that first Sunday with a little glimmer of hope. So much so that he returned for the next Sunday and for the third Sunday. And with each consecutive Sunday, little Ben Hooper's hope was growing. Well, about 6 or 7 Sundays had passed, and little Ben Hooper still attending, still listening to this preacher. Particular Sunday, Ben got so caught up in the message. Time flew by. He was so enthralled by what the preacher was saying. It was almost as if there was a huge sign behind the preacher that read, "For you, little Ben Hooper of unknown parentage, there is hope." Suddenly, the service was over and it ended. And Ben was so taken up by the sermon, by the pastor and his words, that he didn't notice that after he had sat down, a number of people had sat down behind him. And the service was over, and he hadn't left yet. So he hurried from his seat, but this time he couldn't beat feet out the back door, so nobody would notice. As he was struggling, as he was weeping, trying to make his way out to the crowd, suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned around, and there was that preacher with his hand on his shoulder. At that moment, the preacher asked little Ben Hooper the question that had been on the minds of the entire town for 12 years. The preacher asked little Ben Hooper, "And whose boy are you?" As you can imagine, at that point, the church grew eerily quiet. Everyone waiting to hear the response. Well, slowly, a smile began to creep across that preacher's face, until it broke out into a large grin. And he said, "Oh, I know whose boy you are. Why? The family resemblance is unmistakable. Why? You are a creation of God." And then he swatted little Ben Hooper across the rear end, and he said, "That's quite an inheritance you've got there, boy. Now, go see to it that you live up to it." Decades later, Ben Hooper would say that that was the day that he was elected and later re-elected governor of the state of Tennessee. Dear child of God, because of Jesus' suffering for us and his identification with us, we are no longer refugees as enemies of God, but rather as children of God, as children of the King, as citizens of his kingdom. We have been gifted with the status of royalty. It's quite an inheritance